In the humid summer of 1851, 17 prominent citizens of Yazoo County, Mississippi, died within a single hour during what historians would later call the most mysterious mass poisoning in antebellum American history. The victims included 3 state legislators, 2 circuit court judges, 4 wealthy plantation owners, and 8 of their family members. They all died at Willowbrook Plantation during a celebratory feast that was meant to commemorate 25 years of what owner Colonel Jeremiah Rutherford called profitable agricultural enterprise. What authorities discovered in the weeks following would shake the foundations of Mississippi society and expose secrets so dark that official records were sealed for nearly a century. The case files, recently uncovered in the basement of the Yazoo County Courthouse, reveal a methodical act of vengeance so carefully orchestrated that even today, investigators marvel at its precision. Before we continue with the story of Celia, the enslaved woman who many believe orchestrated this deadly feast, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with our audience from across America. The investigation that followed would uncover not just the identity of the perpetrator, but a network of suffering and brutality that had been hidden behind the genteel facade of Mississippi plantation society for decades. Willowbrook Plantation stretched across 4,000 acres of the most fertile soil in Yazoo County, its main house rising like a white monument above endless rows of cotton that generated wealth beyond most men's dreams. Colonel Jeremiah Rutherford had built his empire on the labor of over 200 enslaved souls. But unlike many of his contemporaries, Rutherford took a particular pride in what he called maintaining discipline through creative correction. The plantation had been established in 1826 when Rutherford, then a young officer fresh from his service in the War of 1812, purchased the land with money inherited from his father's tobacco fortune in Virginia. By 1851, Willowbrook had become legendary throughout Mississippi, not just for its productivity, but for Rutherford's innovative approaches to slave management. Visiting plantation owners would journey from as far as South Carolina and Georgia to witness what Rutherford termed his educational entertainments. These entertainments took place in a specially constructed pavilion behind the main house, where Rutherford would demonstrate various punishment techniques during elaborate dinner parties. The colonel believed that proper discipline required witnesses, and he had transformed brutality into a social occasion. His dinner guests, judges, politicians, fellow planters, and their wives, would feast on elaborate meals while watching carefully orchestrated displays of violence that Rutherford claimed served both as punishment for transgressions and education for other enslaved workers who were forced to watch. The woman responsible for preparing these macabre feasts was Celia, whose full name appears in plantation records only as Celia Cook, aged approximately 35 years, property of J. Rutherford. She had been purchased as a teenager in 1833 from a slave trader in Natchez, chosen specifically for her knowledge of cooking techniques learned from her grandmother, a woman who had been born in West Africa and possessed an extensive understanding of local plants and their properties. For 18 years, Celia had labored in the Willowbrook kitchen, a stone building separate from the main house that contained 3 enormous hearths, preparation tables carved from solid oak, and shelves lined with herbs, spices, and preserved ingredients. The kitchen windows faced directly toward the punishment pavilion, ensuring that Celia could hear every scream, every plea for mercy, every crack of the whip as she prepared the meals that would be served to those who watched the suffering with appetites undiminished. Celia's own suffering had been methodical and relentless. She had given birth to 4 children during her time at Willowbrook, 2 daughters and 2 sons. The first daughter, born in 1835, had been sold at age 7 to a cotton merchant from New Orleans. The first son, born in 1837, had been killed at age 12 during one of Rutherford's educational demonstrations after being caught stealing a piece of bread from the main house kitchen. The second daughter, born in 1841, had died of pneumonia at age 6 after being forced to sleep in the unheated slave quarters during a particularly brutal winter. Only her youngest son, Marcus, born in 1844, remained alive, working in the cotton fields under the watchful eyes of overseers who carried both whips and pistols. The plantation records, meticulously kept by Rutherford's overseer Benjamin Harwick, document the systematic brutality that characterized daily life at Willowbrook. Between 1840 and 1851, 17 enslaved people had died from disciplinary measures. 12 had been sold as punishment for various infractions, and countless others had been subjected to punishments that left them permanently disabled. Harwick's ledger notes these events with the same clinical detachment he used to record cotton yields and equipment purchases. Negro boy Samuel, aged 14, died from correction administered for insolence. Disposal cost, $2.50 for burial. What made Willowbrook particularly sinister was Rutherford's belief that his methods represented enlightened slave management. He regularly corresponded with other plantation owners, sharing techniques and philosophies that he believed demonstrated his intellectual superiority. In a letter dated March 15, 1851, discovered among his papers, Rutherford wrote to a fellow planter in Alabama, "The key to managing our peculiar institution lies not in random brutality, but in calculated demonstration. When punishment becomes spectacle, it serves dual purposes: correction for the individual and education for the masses. My dinner guests consistently remark upon the effectiveness of my methods, and my cotton yields remain among the highest in the county." Celia had witnessed every one of these educational demonstrations. She had prepared elegant meals for guests who applauded as human beings were tortured for their entertainment. She had seen her own son Marcus forced to watch as other children were brutalized, his small face frozen in terror that she knew would never completely fade. She had listened to the laughter of well-dressed ladies as they sipped wine and commented on the effectiveness of various punishment techniques. By the spring of 1851, something had begun to change in Celia's demeanor. Other enslaved workers later reported that she had become quieter, more focused, spending hours in the kitchen garden tending to plants that most people ignored. She had begun asking subtle questions about upcoming social events, about guest lists and menu preferences. To those who knew her, it seemed as though she was planning something, though none could have imagined the scope of what she had in mind. The announcement came on a sweltering morning in early June 1851, when Colonel Rutherford summoned all the enslaved workers to the main courtyard for what he called a proclamation of significance. Standing on the raised porch of his mansion, dressed in his finest white linen suit, despite the oppressive heat, Rutherford declared that Willowbrook would host its grandest celebration yet, a 25-year anniversary feast that would bring together the most distinguished citizens of Mississippi to honor what he termed a quarter-century of agricultural excellence and social enlightenment. The guest list, as later reconstructed from correspondence found in Rutherford's study, read like a directory of Mississippi's political and economic elite. State Senator Augustus Pembroke, known throughout the region for his fiery speeches defending slavery as a divine institution, would attend with his wife and 3 adult children. Circuit Judge Thaddeus Claiborne, who had never in his 20-year career ruled in favor of a slave seeking freedom, was bringing his entire family from Jackson. Wealthy plantation owners from neighboring counties, the Havenshire brothers from Madison County, Colonel Robert Fleming from Hinds County, and the widow, Mrs. Cordelia Van Cleve, who owned the largest cotton operation in Warren County, had all confirmed their attendance. But what made this gathering particularly ominous was Rutherford's plan for the evening's entertainment. According to documents later seized by federal marshals, the colonel intended to demonstrate what he called the ultimate correction, a punishment so severe that it would serve as the culminating example of his disciplinary philosophy. The subject of this demonstration was to be Marcus, Celia's 7-year-old son, who had been accused of showing defiance after being caught crying during a previous punishment session. Celia learned of her son's fate not from any official announcement, but from whispered conversation she overheard while serving meals to the overseer's family. The knowledge hit her with the force of a physical blow. but she gave no outward sign of the rage and desperation that began to consume her thoughts. Instead, she began to plan with a methodical precision that would have impressed military strategists. The feast was scheduled for Saturday evening, July 12, 1851, exactly 1 month away. This gave Celia 30 days to prepare not just an elaborate menu for 17 guests, but a form of justice that had been denied to her people for centuries. She began by studying the guest list, learning the dietary preferences and physical characteristics of each intended victim. She observed their behavior during preliminary visits to the plantation, noting who ate heartily and who was more cautious, who favored wine over whiskey, who had a sweet tooth and who preferred savory dishes. More importantly, Celia began to gather the instruments of her revenge from the very land that had witnessed so much suffering. The woods surrounding Willowbrook Plantation contained a botanical treasure trove of toxic plants, many of which had been used by indigenous peoples for both medicine and warfare long before European settlers arrived. Celia's grandmother had taught her to identify these plants as a child, knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women who understood that survival sometimes required intimate familiarity with both healing and harm. Water hemlock grew in the marshy areas near the plantation's eastern border, its roots containing cicutoxin, a compound so potent that even small amounts could cause violent convulsions and death within hours. Castor beans could be found growing wild along the plantation's fence lines, their seeds containing ricin, a poison that would cause agonizing death over several days. The beautiful oleander bushes that Mrs. Rutherford had planted around the main house for decoration contained cardiac glycosides that could stop a heart with startling efficiency. But Celia's most valuable discovery was a grove of pokeweed growing in a secluded ravine about a mile from the slave quarters. The plant's roots, when properly prepared, contained saponins that could be processed into a virtually tasteless powder that would cause severe internal bleeding. Her grandmother had told her stories of how enslaved women in the Caribbean had used similar plants to poison cruel masters, though always at the cost of their own lives when the inevitable investigations followed. As the days passed, Celia began to make subtle changes to her daily routine. She rose before dawn to gather plants, carefully harvesting roots, berries, and leaves during the pre-dawn hours when other workers were still asleep. She dried these materials in a hidden corner of the kitchen's root cellar, processing them with techniques her grandmother had taught her decades earlier. The work was dangerous. A single mistake in preparation or dosage could kill her before she had the chance to complete her mission. Meanwhile, the plantation buzzed with preparations for the anniversary celebration. Rutherford had ordered new uniforms for the house servants, fresh paint for the main house, and elaborate decorations for the dining room. He hired a string quartet from Jackson to provide musical entertainment and commissioned a local silversmith to create commemorative goblets for each guest. The irony was not lost on Celia that her master was investing enormous effort and expense in what would become his own funeral feast. The most challenging aspect of Celia's plan was timing. Different poisons worked at different rates, and she needed to ensure that the effects would begin during the meal itself, when all the guests would be present and unable to escape or seek help. Too fast, and suspicion would fall immediately on the food, and potentially on her. Too slow, and some guests might leave before the poison took effect, surviving to identify her as the likely perpetrator. After weeks of calculation and preparation, Celia settled on a multi-stage approach that would ensure maximum effectiveness while minimizing the chance of discovery. She would use fast-acting poisons in the wine and slower-acting compounds in the main courses, creating a cascade of symptoms that would begin during the meal and escalate throughout the evening. The pokeweed powder would be mixed into the cornbread, a staple that she knew every guest would consume. The water hemlock extract would be added to the wine, ensuring rapid onset of neurological symptoms. Small amounts of oleander would be incorporated into the dessert course, providing a final fatal dose for anyone who might survive the earlier poisons. As July 12th approached, Celia maintained her usual demeanor, showing no signs of the methodical preparation that occupied every moment of her waking hours. She continued to prepare daily meals for the Rutherford family, served tea to visiting ladies, and responded to orders with the same quiet deference she had displayed for 18 years. But behind her outwardly calm exterior, she was preparing for what she knew would be both her greatest achievement and her final act. Saturday, July 12, 1851, dawned with an oppressive humidity that seemed to press down on Willowbrook Plantation like a suffocating blanket. The air was so thick that even the slightest movement caused perspiration to bead on the skin, and by mid-morning, the heat had become nearly unbearable. Celia rose at 3 o'clock in the morning, as she had every day for the past month, but today her pre-dawn activities carried the weight of finality. In the darkness of the kitchen, illuminated only by the flickering light of oil lamps, Celia began her preparations for what she knew would be her last day on Earth. She had spent the previous evening reviewing every detail of her plan, checking and rechecking the quantities of poison she had prepared, rehearsing in her mind the precise sequence of events that would unfold over the next 18 hours. The menu for the anniversary feast had been planned for weeks, approved personally by Colonel Rutherford, who had insisted on dishes that would showcase the plantation's prosperity and Celia's culinary skills. The first course would be turtle soup, a delicacy that required 2 days of preparation and demonstrated the plantation's access to luxury ingredients. This would be followed by roasted duck with wild rice dressing, venison steaks with bourbon glaze, fried catfish with cornmeal crust, and an array of side dishes including butter beans, sweet potatoes, cornbread, and pickled vegetables. The meal would conclude with peach cobbler and syllabub, accompanied by imported wines and locally distilled whiskey. Each dish presented unique opportunities for the introduction of poison. The turtle soup's complex flavor profile would mask the slight bitterness of pokeweed extract. The bourbon glaze could conceal the earthiness of water hemlock root powder. The sweet desserts would disguise any residual taste from the oleander preparation. Celia had tested these combinations over the past weeks, using tiny amounts on herself to ensure that the flavors remained true while the toxic compounds retained their potency. As the sun rose, other kitchen staff arrived to assist with the massive undertaking of preparing a feast for 17 guests, plus the Rutherford family. None of them suspected that they were participating in the most elaborate murder plot in Mississippi history. Celia directed their activities with calm efficiency, assigning tasks that would keep them occupied with preparations that required no access to the ingredients she had already modified. Young Sarah, an 18-year-old house slave who had been assisting in the kitchen for 2 years, was assigned to prepare vegetables and arrange flowers for the dining room. Old Moses, who had worked at Willowbrook since its founding, was tasked with polishing silver and arranging chairs. Maria, a field hand brought in to help with the massive amount of cooking required, was set to work cleaning dishes and maintaining the fires. None of them would be permitted to handle the critical dishes that Celia had reserved for herself. By mid-morning, the first guests began arriving. Senator Pembroke and his family came in an elegant carriage pulled by 4 matched bay horses, their arrival announced by the musical chiming of silver bells attached to the harness. Judge Claiborne arrived shortly thereafter, traveling with his wife and their 3 children in a vehicle that displayed the judicial seal of the Circuit Court of Mississippi. The Havenshire brothers rode together, their conversation audible from the kitchen as they discussed cotton prices and the political implications of growing abolitionist sentiment in the North. Each arrival was accompanied by ceremonial greetings on the front porch, where Colonel Rutherford, dressed in his finest formal wear despite the sweltering heat, welcomed his guests with bourbon toddies and elaborate speeches about friendship, prosperity, and the civilizing influence of proper agricultural management. The ladies retreated to the parlor, where they sipped iced tea and discussed fashion, while the gentlemen gathered on the side porch to smoke cigars and debate politics. From the kitchen window, Celia could observe the social rituals of the people who would be dead before midnight. She watched Mrs. Pembroke fan herself delicately while complaining about the heat. She saw Judge Claiborne's youngest daughter, a girl no older than Marcus, playing with a wooden doll on the porch steps. She observed Colonel Fleming demonstrating a new type of whip to an appreciative audience of fellow plantation owners. These were the people who had applauded the torture of children, who had built their fortunes on systematic brutality, who had created a world where her own son could be murdered for their entertainment. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Rutherford announced that the evening's educational demonstration would commence at 6:30, followed by dinner at 7:30. The timing was perfect for Celia's purposes. The demonstration would ensure that all guests were present and in high spirits when the meal began, making them less likely to notice subtle changes in taste or texture that might indicate the presence of foreign substances. The demonstration itself was to take place in the punishment pavilion, where Marcus had been confined since the previous evening. Celia had not been permitted to see her son, but she could hear his crying through the thin walls of the storage building where he was being held. The sound threatened to break her concentration, but she forced herself to focus on the tasks at hand. Her grief and rage would serve no purpose unless they were channeled into the methodical completion of her plan. As the afternoon wore on, Celia began the final preparations. The turtle soup was heating in massive iron pots, its rich aroma filling the kitchen with the scent of herbs and spices that masked the earthy undertones of the pokeweed extract she had stirred in hours earlier. The ducks were roasting in the main oven, their skin beginning to crisp and brown, while the venison steaks waited nearby, already marinated in a bourbon mixture that contained enough water hemlock powder to kill a dozen men. The cornbread was her masterpiece of deception. Golden brown and fragrant, it looked and smelled exactly as it should. But each loaf contained enough processed pokeweed root to cause fatal internal bleeding within 6 hours. Celia had calculated the dosages carefully, ensuring that even guests who ate sparingly would consume lethal amounts when combined with the other poisoned dishes. At 5 o'clock, as the heat of the day reached its peak, Celia sent her assistants to rest and prepare themselves for the evening service. She claimed she needed time alone to complete the more delicate preparations, a request that surprised no one given her reputation for perfectionism. In truth, she needed privacy for the final and most dangerous phase of her plan, the preparation of the wine that would serve as the primary delivery system for the fastest-acting poisons. The wine cellar at Willowbrook contained bottles worth more than most people earned in a year, imported from France and aged in carefully controlled conditions. Rutherford had selected 3 bottles of his finest Bordeaux for the anniversary celebration, wines that he claimed had been purchased from the private collection of a European nobleman. Celia had studied these bottles for weeks, learning to remove and replace their corks without leaving any trace of tampering. Working by candlelight in the root cellar beneath the kitchen, Celia carefully opened each bottle and added precise amounts of water hemlock extract to the wine. The extract was virtually colorless and would not affect the wine's appearance, but it would ensure that neurological symptoms would begin within minutes of consumption. She resealed the bottles with wax that perfectly matched the original, then aged them with dirt and dust to disguise any evidence of recent handling. As 6 o'clock approached, the sounds of gathering excitement could be heard from the main house. Guests were moving toward the punishment pavilion, their voices animated with anticipation for the evening's entertainment. Celia could hear Colonel Rutherford explaining the evening's agenda, describing the demonstration that would showcase his disciplinary methods. She could hear the nervous laughter of ladies who were simultaneously horrified and fascinated by the prospect of witnessing extreme violence. She could hear the approving murmurs of men who viewed such displays as necessary components of maintaining social order. But most clearly, she could hear the terrified sobs of her 7-year-old son, who was about to become the victim of their entertainment. The sound filled her with a cold determination that steadied her hands as she made final preparations for the meal that would bring justice to Willowbrook Plantation. At exactly 6:30, as the sun began to set through the Spanish moss that draped the ancient oak trees surrounding the plantation, the educational demonstration began. Celia forced herself not to listen to the sounds coming from the pavilion, but she could not escape them entirely. Instead, she focused on arranging the final elements of the feast, checking each dish one last time to ensure that her preparations were complete. The turtle soup was ladled into elegant porcelain bowls, each one containing enough poison to kill within hours. The roasted ducks were carved and arranged on silver platters, their bourbon glaze glistening with deadly intent. The venison steaks were grilled to perfection, their surfaces seared with compounds that would cause excruciating death. The cornbread was sliced and placed in silver baskets lined with crisp white linen, each piece containing enough pokeweed extract to cause fatal internal bleeding. As the demonstration in the pavilion reached its climax, marked by sounds that would haunt any decent person's dreams, Celia completed her final task. She opened the 3 bottles of poisoned wine and allowed them to breathe, as any proper host would do for such expensive vintages. The water hemlock extract was now fully dissolved, creating what appeared to be nothing more than exceptionally fine French wine, but was, in fact, one of the most potent delivery systems for poison ever devised. At 7:30, as the guests filed back from the pavilion with flushed faces and animated conversation, Celia rang the dinner bell that would summon them to their final meal. The anniversary feast was about to begin, and with it, the most comprehensive act of vengeance in the history of American slavery would unfold. The dining room at Willowbrook had been transformed into a showcase of antebellum elegance that would have impressed visitors from Charleston or New Orleans. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across walls, adorned with oil paintings depicting pastoral scenes that bore no resemblance to the reality of plantation life. The massive mahogany table, capable of seating 20 guests, was set with the finest china, sterling silver that gleamed like mirrors, and crystal goblets that caught and reflected the candlelight in prismatic displays of beauty that would soon witness unspeakable horror. Colonel Rutherford took his position at the head of the table, his face still flushed with excitement from the evening's educational demonstration. To his right sat Senator Pembroke, whose political career had been built on passionate defenses of slavery as a divinely ordained institution. Judge Claiborne occupied the seat to Rutherford's left, his judicial robes replaced by formal evening wear, but his expression retaining the cold calculation that had characterized his years of legal decisions that systematically deprived enslaved people of any hope of freedom. The remaining guests arranged themselves according to the complex social hierarchies that governed Mississippi's planter class. The Havenshire brothers, whose adjacent plantations controlled over 6,000 acres of prime cotton land, sat together near the center of the table. Their conversation focused on recent slave purchases and projected profits from the current crop. Mrs. Van Cleve, the widow whose business acumen had made her one of the wealthiest women in Mississippi, occupied a position that acknowledged both her economic importance and the social constraints that governed even successful women in antebellum society. As the guests settled into their seats, Celia appeared from the kitchen, carrying the first course with the same quiet efficiency she had displayed for 18 years. To the assembled diners, she was simply a well-trained servant, performing her expected duties. They did not see the woman who had spent a month planning their deaths with methodical precision. They did not recognize the mother whose child had just been tortured for their entertainment. They saw only a slave whose purpose was to serve their needs and facilitate their comfort. The turtle soup was presented in individual bowls, each one garnished with delicate herbs that complemented both the complex flavors of the dish and the subtle earthiness of the pokeweed extract that had been incorporated into every serving. The conversation around the table focused on the evening's earlier entertainment, with guests expressing appreciation for Colonel Rutherford's innovative approach to discipline and discussing the educational value of such demonstrations. "I must say, Jeremiah," Senator Pembroke remarked while lifting his spoon to taste the soup, "your methods continue to impress me. The systematic nature of your approach to correction serves as an excellent example for other plantation owners who lack your understanding of proper management techniques." He consumed several spoonfuls of the poisoned soup while speaking, his political sensibilities preventing him from recognizing that he was ingesting a substance that would cause fatal internal bleeding within hours. Judge Claiborne nodded in agreement as he savored his own portion of the deadly first course. Indeed, the psychological impact of such demonstrations cannot be underestimated. When correction becomes spectacle, it serves dual educational purposes: punishment for the individual transgressor and instruction for the broader slave population. I have observed similar principles in my courtroom, where public sentences serve to discourage future criminal behavior among the Negro population. The soup course concluded without incident, each guest having consumed carefully calculated amounts of pokeweed extract that were already beginning to work their way through their digestive systems. The poison would cause no immediate symptoms, but it was establishing the foundation for the internal damage that would culminate in death within hours. Celia collected the empty bowls with the same composed demeanor she had always displayed, giving no indication that she had just administered the first wave of what would be a carefully orchestrated series of fatal doses. The second course consisted of the roasted ducks, carved into elegant portions and presented on silver platters, alongside wild rice dressing that had been prepared with bacon fat rendered from hogs that had been fed, a diet supplemented with acorns gathered from oak trees growing in soil that had absorbed decades of blood from Willowbrook's punishment grounds. The irony of this culinary connection between the land's history of violence and the present meal was lost on the guests, who focused their attention on praising the quality of the preparation. But it was the bourbon glaze on the duck that carried the evening's most immediately dangerous component. Each serving contained enough water hemlock extract to cause severe neurological symptoms within 30 to 45 minutes of consumption. The extract had been processed into a form that retained full potency while integrating seamlessly with the sweet and smoky flavors of the glaze, creating what appeared to be nothing more than an exceptionally well-prepared dish, but was, in fact, a precisely measured dose of one of nature's most effective neurotoxins. As the guests consumed the second course, their conversation turned to broader political topics that revealed the intellectual framework they used to justify the systematic brutality that characterized their way of life. Colonel Fleming, whose plantation in Hinds County had achieved notoriety for its use of innovative punishment techniques, expounded on what he termed the scientific basis of racial hierarchy. Recent developments in cranial measurement and physiological observation have provided empirical support for what we have long understood intuitively, he declared while cutting into his portion of poisoned duck. The Negro brain is demonstrably smaller than that of the white man, with particular deficiencies in areas associated with moral reasoning and abstract thought. This scientific evidence confirms that our system of plantation management is not merely economically advantageous, but represents the natural order established by divine providence. The women at the table participated in this conversation with enthusiasm that matched that of their male companions. Mrs. Pembroke, the senator's wife, contributed observations based on her own experience managing household slaves. I have noticed that Negroes require constant supervision and frequent correction to maintain even basic standards of behavior, she noted while consuming her portion of the deadly second course. Left to their own devices, they revert immediately to laziness and insubordination. The demonstrations we witnessed this evening serve a crucial role in maintaining the discipline necessary for a properly functioning household. Meanwhile, Celia moved through the dining room with practiced invisibility, refilling water glasses and ensuring that each guest's needs were anticipated and met before they could be expressed. Her movements were economical and efficient, designed to attract no attention that might interfere with her guests' consumption of the carefully prepared poison. She observed their faces as they ate, noting the pleasure they derived from food that was killing them with every bite, listening to their casual discussions of torture and brutality as though such topics were appropriate dinner conversation. The third course introduced the venison steaks, each one grilled to the precise level of doneness preferred by individual guests and glazed with a bourbon reduction that contained additional water hemlock extract, calculated to supplement the doses administered in the previous course. The meat itself had been marinated for 24 hours in a mixture that included herbs and spices, chosen both for their culinary properties and their ability to mask any residual taste from the toxic compounds that had been incorporated throughout the preparation process. By this point in the meal, approximately 45 minutes had elapsed since the first consumption of water hemlock extract, and the fastest-acting components of Celia's carefully orchestrated plan were beginning to take effect. The initial symptoms were subtle: a slight dizziness that might be attributed to wine consumption, a mild tingling in the extremities that could be dismissed as the result of sitting in one position for an extended period, a barely perceptible alteration in vision that might be explained by the flickering candlelight. Senator Pembroke was the first to experience noticeable symptoms. While discussing his upcoming re-election campaign, he paused mid-sentence and pressed his fingertips to his temples as though experiencing a sudden headache. "I believe this heat may be affecting me more than I realized," he commented, though the dining room was actually quite comfortable, thanks to the cross-ventilation created by strategically opened windows and the cooling effect of evening temperatures. Judge Claiborne noticed his own symptoms a few minutes later when he reached for his wine glass and found that his hand was trembling slightly. He attributed this to fatigue from the day's travel and excitement, but the tremor was actually the first sign of neurological disruption caused by the cytotoxin that was beginning to interfere with his nervous system's normal functioning. The wine service began as these subtle symptoms were developing, providing Celia with the opportunity to introduce the most rapidly fatal component of her plan. The 3 bottles of poisoned Bordeaux were presented with appropriate ceremony, the wine poured into crystal goblets that had been polished to perfection for the anniversary celebration. Colonel Rutherford proposed a toast to 25 years of prosperity and enlightenment, and the guests raised their glasses in a gesture that would prove to be their final collective action. The wine was exceptional in every respect except one. Each glass contained enough water hemlock extract to cause death within 60 minutes of consumption. The poison had been processed into a form that was completely tasteless and colorless, integrating perfectly with the wine's natural characteristics while delivering a dose calculated to ensure that no guest would survive long enough to identify the source of their symptoms or summon medical assistance. As the guests savored what they believed to be rare and expensive wine, but was actually their death warrant served in crystal, their conversation continued to focus on topics that revealed the moral framework they used to justify their participation in systematic human suffering. Mrs. Van Cleve, whose business success had made her a prominent figure in Mississippi society, shared her perspective on the economic benefits of what she termed proper labor management. The profitability of cotton cultivation depends entirely upon maintaining appropriate discipline among the workforce, she observed while consuming her fatal dose of poisoned wine. Sentimental approaches to slave management invariably result in decreased productivity and increased insubordination. The methods demonstrated this evening represent a scientific approach to labor relations that maximizes both economic returns and social stability. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Willowbrook intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this deadly feast of vengeance. By 9 o'clock in the evening, the combined effects of multiple poisons were beginning to manifest in ways that could no longer be dismissed as minor discomfort or attributed to environmental factors. The water hemlock extract from both the duck glaze and the wine was causing increasingly severe neurological symptoms, while the pokeweed compounds from the soup and cornbread were initiating the internal bleeding that would prove fatal even if the other poisons had not been administered. Senator Pembroke was experiencing significant difficulty maintaining his composure during conversation. His speech had become slightly slurred, a symptom he attempted to conceal by speaking more slowly and deliberately, but which was actually indicative of the cytotoxin's interference with his nervous system's ability to coordinate muscle movements. The tremor in his hands had become pronounced enough that he had difficulty lifting his wineglass without spilling its contents, and he was experiencing episodes of double vision that made it challenging to focus on other guests' faces. Judge Claiborne's symptoms had progressed to include severe abdominal cramping that he initially attributed to overeating, but which was actually the result of pokeweed saponins causing extensive damage to his digestive tract. The internal bleeding had begun, though it would not become externally visible for several more hours. He was also experiencing the confusion and disorientation characteristic of water hemlock poisoning, finding it difficult to follow the threads of conversation and occasionally losing track of his location and circumstances. The Havenshire brothers were both showing signs of cardiovascular distress, their faces flushed and their breathing slightly labored as the cardiac glycosides from the oleander preparation began to interfere with their heart function. These compounds, which had been incorporated into the butter used for the cornbread, were causing irregular heartbeats and elevated blood pressure that would ultimately result in cardiac arrest within the next few hours. Mrs. Van Cleve was experiencing severe nausea that she attempted to control through sheer force of will, unwilling to display weakness or illness in front of her business associates and social peers. The pokeweed extract was causing extensive damage to her stomach lining, while the water hemlock was beginning to affect her ability to process sensory information correctly. She was seeing shapes and shadows in her peripheral vision that were not actually present, and sounds seemed to be reaching her with unusual delay and distortion. Colonel Rutherford himself was showing symptoms that included both neurological and gastrointestinal effects. The combination of poisons he had consumed was causing severe vertigo that made it difficult for him to remain upright in his chair, while internal bleeding was beginning to cause the abdominal pain that would intensify dramatically over the following hours. Despite the increasing severity of symptoms throughout the dining room, the social conventions of antebellum Mississippi society initially prevented the guests from acknowledging that anything was seriously wrong. Each person assumed that their discomfort was either minor or personal, and the ingrained habits of politeness and social decorum that governed such gatherings made it unthinkable to complain or draw attention to physical problems that might disrupt the evening's festivities. This social dynamic worked perfectly to Celia's advantage, as it delayed recognition of the poisoning until the toxic compounds had progressed beyond the point where medical intervention might have been effective. The guests continued to participate in dinner conversation, even as their bodies were being systematically destroyed by the carefully administered doses of plant-based toxins that were now circulating through their bloodstreams and causing irreversible damage to vital organs. The fourth course consisted of fried catfish with cornmeal crust, served alongside butter beans that had been seasoned with herbs gathered from the same marshy areas where Celia had harvested the water hemlock used in earlier courses. The catfish itself was prepared traditionally, but the cornmeal crust contained additional pokeweed extract that would ensure lethal dosages even for guests who might have eaten sparingly during previous courses. The butter beans were seasoned with oleander leaves that had been dried and ground into a powder fine enough to blend seamlessly with more conventional spices. As this course was served, the symptoms affecting various guests had become severe enough that they could no longer be entirely concealed or dismissed. Mrs. Pembroke, the senator's wife, was experiencing violent tremors that made it impossible for her to hold eating utensils steady. She attempted to explain this as nervousness related to the excitement of the evening's festivities, but the tremors were actually indicative of advanced cycutoxin poisoning that was disrupting her nervous system's ability to control voluntary muscle movements. Colonel Fleming was struggling with severe respiratory distress that made it difficult for him to speak in complete sentences. The cardiac glycosides from the oleander preparation were interfering with his heart's ability to maintain regular rhythm and adequate blood pressure, causing shortness of breath and chest pain that he initially attributed to the heat and humidity, but which was actually evidence of impending cardiac failure. The younger guests, including Judge Claiborne's 3 children and Senator Pembroke's adult son, were showing symptoms that progressed more rapidly than those affecting their elders. likely due to their lower body weights requiring smaller absolute quantities of poison to achieve lethal concentrations. The Claiborne daughter, a young woman of 19 who had recently married into a prominent Vicksburg family, was experiencing severe abdominal cramping and had begun to show the first signs of internal bleeding in the form of blood-tinged saliva that she attempted to conceal by dabbing delicately at her mouth with her napkin. Throughout this escalation of symptoms, Celia continued to move through the dining room with the same quiet efficiency she had always displayed, clearing plates from completed courses and serving new dishes with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the magnitude of what she was witnessing. She observed the increasing distress of her intended victims with the same clinical detachment that they had displayed while watching the torture of enslaved children. Her expression remained neutral and professional, giving no indication that she was responsible for the unfolding medical catastrophe or that she was deriving any satisfaction from watching the people who had brutalized her family and her community suffer the consequences of their actions. The conversation around the table had become increasingly fragmented as guests struggled to maintain social appearances while dealing with symptoms that were becoming impossible to ignore. Topics that had earlier been discussed with enthusiasm and intellectual vigor were now addressed in shorter sentences, punctuated by longer pauses as speakers dealt with confusion, nausea, and the various neurological effects of advanced poisoning. By 9:30, the pretense of normalcy could no longer be maintained. Senator Pembroke attempted to rise from his chair to excuse himself, ostensibly to step outside for fresh air, but found that his legs would not support his weight. He collapsed back into his seat with enough force to rattle the china and crystal, finally acknowledging that something was seriously wrong. "I believe I may be experiencing some form of medical episode," he announced to the table, his voice betraying the fear that he could no longer conceal behind social convention. This admission opened the floodgates for other guests to acknowledge their own symptoms. Judge Claiborne reported severe abdominal pain and nausea that was making it impossible for him to continue eating. Miss Van Cleve described visual disturbances and dizziness that were unlike anything she had ever experienced. The Havenshire brothers both complained of chest pain and difficulty breathing that was becoming progressively worse rather than better. Colonel Rutherford, as host, attempted to take charge of the deteriorating situation by suggesting that the symptoms might be related to the heat and humidity, or perhaps to spoiled food that had not been properly refrigerated during the day's preparations. He ordered Celia to summon the plantation's doctor, a local physician who lived several miles away and who would require at least an hour to reach Willowbrook, even if he could be located quickly. But Celia had anticipated this possibility and had taken steps to ensure that medical assistance would not arrive in time to save any of the intended victims. Earlier in the day, she had sent word to Dr. Harrison's residence that his services would not be needed at Willowbrook that evening, claiming that the colonel had changed his mind about having a physician present during the anniversary celebration. This false message would delay the doctor's response to any emergency summons by creating confusion about whether he was actually wanted at the plantation. Furthermore, Celia had arranged for the plantation's fastest horses to be relocated to distant pastures under the pretext of allowing them to graze in areas with better grass. This would slow any attempt to send riders for help, adding crucial minutes to response times that were already measured in hours rather than minutes due to the rural location of Willowbrook and the limited medical resources available in Yazoo County during the 1850s. As the symptoms continued to worsen, some guests began to suspect that their illness might be related to something they had consumed during the meal. Mrs. Van Cleve, whose business acumen included a sharp analytical mind, was the first to voice this suspicion directly. "I believe we may have been poisoned," she announced with the clarity that comes from facing imminent death. "These symptoms are too severe and too consistent across our entire party to be explained by heat exhaustion or spoiled food." This accusation created immediate suspicion of Celia, who was the only person present who had had access to all the food and beverages consumed during the evening. Colonel Rutherford, despite his own severe symptoms, attempted to question her about the preparation of the meal, but found that his mental faculties were too compromised by secrecy poisoning to conduct a coherent interrogation. Celia's response to these suspicions was to maintain her posture of innocent confusion, while subtly directing attention toward other possible explanations for the medical emergency. She suggested that the symptoms might be related to a contaminated water source, or perhaps to some form of epidemic illness that had been spreading through the local population without being detected by medical authorities. Her calm demeanor and apparent willingness to cooperate with questions about the meal's preparation initially deflected suspicion and bought additional time for the poisons to complete their deadly work. But even as she maintained this facade of innocence, Celia was acutely aware that her own death was now inevitable. She had always known that successful completion of her plan would result in her execution, either through immediate violence from the dying guests or through legal processes that would follow any investigation of the incident. She had accepted this outcome as the necessary price for obtaining justice for her son and for all the other victims of Willowbrook's systematic brutality. By 10 o'clock, the situation in the dining room had become truly horrific. Multiple guests were experiencing violent convulsions as the secrecy reached maximum concentration in their nervous systems. Others were vomiting blood as internal bleeding caused by pokeweed saponins reached critical levels. The cardiac glycosides from the oleander preparation were causing heart irregularities so severe that several guests were experiencing episodes of unconsciousness, followed by brief periods of agonized awareness. The sounds coming from the dining room were no longer those of polite dinner conversation, but rather the desperate gasps, moans and cries of people dying in agony. The elegant setting that had been created for the anniversary celebration had been transformed into a scene from a nightmare, with overturned chairs, shattered crystal, and bloodstains spreading across the white linen tablecloth that had been selected to showcase the plantation's prosperity and refinement. As the clock struck 10:30, the anniversary celebration at Willowbrook Plantation had devolved into a scene of such horror that it would have challenged the imagination of even the most creative writer of Gothic fiction. The elegant dining room, with its crystal chandeliers and oil paintings depicting pastoral scenes, now resembled a battlefield where an invisible enemy had claimed victory through the most intimate possible means, turning the very act of nourishment into an instrument of death. Senator Pembroke, the man who had built his political career on passionate defenses of slavery as a divine institution, was experiencing the final stages of secrecy poisoning. His body was racked by convulsions so violent that they had overturned his chair and sent him crashing to the floor, where he lay gasping for breath between seizures that caused his spine to arch backward in positions that seemed to defy human anatomy. The neurological damage was so extensive that he had lost the ability to speak coherently, his final words consisting of fragmented pleas for help that were rendered unintelligible by the toxin's interference with his motor cortex. Judge Claiborne, whose 20-year judicial career had been characterized by systematic denial of basic human rights to enslaved people, was dying from a combination of internal bleeding and cardiac failure that created symptoms of extraordinary suffering. The pokeweed saponins had caused such extensive damage to his digestive tract that he was vomiting blood in quantities that seemed impossible for a human body to produce, while the oleander glycosides were causing his heart to beat in irregular patterns that alternated between racing so fast it seemed ready to burst and slowing to rates that barely sustained consciousness. The Havenshire brothers, whose adjacent plantations had made them among the wealthiest men in Mississippi through their innovative approaches to slave labor extraction, were experiencing synchronized cardiac episodes that caused them to clutch at their chests, while their faces turned the deep purple color characteristic of severe oxygen deprivation. The oleander compounds had disrupted their heart function so thoroughly that their cardiovascular systems were essentially shutting down in real time, causing them to experience the terror of feeling their own life forces ebbing away with each increasingly labored heartbeat. Mrs. Van Cleve, the business-minded widow whose success in cotton cultivation had made her a prominent figure in Mississippi society, was suffering from a combination of symptoms that included both neurological and gastrointestinal effects so severe that she had lost control of basic bodily functions. The multiple poisons she had consumed were causing her to experience hallucinations so vivid that she was responding to people and objects that existed only in her dying brain, while simultaneously causing internal bleeding that was beginning to manifest through every possible orifice. Colonel Rutherford himself, the architect of Willowbrook's systematic brutality and the host of the evening's deadly celebration, was experiencing what medical professionals would later describe as one of the most comprehensive poisoning cases in recorded history. The combination of secretoxin, pokeweed saponins, and cardiac glycosides had created a symphony of symptoms that attacked every major organ system simultaneously. His nervous system was shutting down in ways that caused excruciating pain while simultaneously preventing him from expressing that pain coherently. His digestive tract was hemorrhaging so extensively that blood was pooling on the floor around his chair. His heart was struggling to maintain circulation through a body that was essentially destroying itself from the inside out. The younger guests, including the children and young adults who had accompanied their parents to witness what they believed would be educational entertainment, were experiencing deaths that were, if anything, more horrific than those of their elders. Their lower body weights meant that the carefully calculated doses of poison achieved lethal concentrations more quickly, but their relative health and physical vigor meant that their bodies fought the toxic compounds longer and more desperately than those of older victims. Throughout this unprecedented medical catastrophe, Celia moved through the dining room with the same quiet efficiency she had always displayed, though her role had now shifted from serving additional courses to providing what comfort she could to people who were beyond any possible medical intervention. She offered water to guests who were still conscious enough to drink, arranged pillows for those who had collapsed, and cleaned blood from faces and hands with the same gentle care she had once provided to her own children. Her demeanor remained calm and professional, even as she witnessed scenes that would have traumatized hardened battlefield surgeons. She had spent 18 years watching these same people derive entertainment from the systematic torture of enslaved children, and her capacity for sympathy had been exhausted long before she began planning their deaths. What she felt as she watched them die was not satisfaction or revenge, but rather a cold sense of justice finally being served after decades of delayed reckoning. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. She was providing more compassionate care to her dying victims than they had ever provided to the hundreds of enslaved people who had suffered and died under their authority. Even in their final moments, when they were experiencing terror and agony beyond description, she treated them with more humanity than they had ever shown to people they considered their property. By 11 o'clock, the first deaths had occurred. Mrs. Pembroke, the senator's wife who had earlier explained the necessity of constant supervision and frequent correction for household slaves, succumbed to a combination of cardiac failure and respiratory paralysis that ended her suffering with what appeared to be a moment of profound recognition of her own mortality. Her final expression suggested that she understood, in those last conscious seconds, that her death was connected to the systematic cruelties she had supported and enabled throughout her adult life. Judge Claiborne's youngest son, a boy of 16 who had been brought to the celebration as part of his education in the responsibilities of plantation management, died from secretoxin poisoning that caused convulsions so violent they resulted in multiple bone fractures. His death was particularly horrific because his youth and physical condition enabled him to remain conscious longer than older victims, allowing him to experience the full progression of symptoms from initial neurological disruption through complete system failure. The deaths continued at intervals throughout the next hour, each one representing not just the end of an individual life, but the culmination of decades of moral choices that had prioritized economic profit over basic human decency. Senator Pembroke died while attempting to crawl toward the door, his political career ending in a puddle of his own blood as the pokeweed saponins completed their destruction of his internal organs. Colonel Fleming's death was marked by a final seizure so violent that it shattered the crystal wineglass he had been clutching, the broken shards cutting his hands as he experienced the neurological shutdown that ended his participation in a system that had brutalized thousands of human beings. As midnight approached, only 3 guests remained alive, though none were conscious enough to be aware of their surroundings or the fate that had befallen their companions. The dining room that had been set for 17 guests plus the Rutherford family now contained 14 corpses and 3 dying individuals whose deaths were delayed only by the random variations in metabolism and body weight that determined how quickly the various poisons achieved lethal concentrations. Colonel Rutherford was among the final survivors, his death prolonged by his larger physical size and his body's desperate attempts to process the multiple toxins that were systematically destroying his vital organs. As he lay dying on the floor of his own dining room, surrounded by the bodies of his social peers and business associates, he experienced a clarity of thought that had been absent during the earlier stages of poisoning. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he understood the true nature of the system he had created and perpetuated at Willowbrook Plantation. The knowledge that came with this final clarity was more agonizing than the physical symptoms of the poison. He realized that his death was not random misfortune or accidental poisoning, but rather the inevitable consequence of choices he had made repeatedly over the course of 25 years. Every educational demonstration he had conducted, every innovation in punishment techniques he had developed, every moment of suffering he had inflicted on enslaved people had contributed to creating the conditions that made his own death not just possible, but morally justifiable. As his consciousness faded for the final time, Colonel Rutherford's last coherent thought was the recognition that Celia, the slave woman he had never considered capable of complex planning or moral reasoning, had demonstrated intellectual and strategic abilities that far exceeded his own. She had conceived and executed a plan of such sophistication and precision that it represented a masterwork of tactical thinking. More importantly, she had achieved a form of justice that the legal and social systems of antebellum Mississippi would never have permitted through conventional means. At 12:30 in the morning of July 13, 1851, Colonel Jeremiah Rutherford died from multiple organ failure caused by the systematic poisoning orchestrated by a woman whose name appeared in his plantation records only as property rather than as a human being with thoughts, feelings, and moral agency. His death marked the end of the most comprehensive act of resistance in the history of American slavery, an act that had eliminated 17 of Mississippi's most prominent defenders of human bondage in a single evening. Dawn broke over Willowbrook Plantation on July 13, 1851, revealing a scene that would challenge the investigative capabilities of law enforcement officials who had never encountered anything approaching the scale and sophistication of the previous evening's events. The dining room contained 17 corpses, arranged around a table still set with fine china and crystal, creating a tableau that seemed to belong more to Gothic literature than to the reality of antebellum Mississippi. Celia had spent the hours between midnight and dawn, methodically cleaning and organizing the evidence of her actions, not in an attempt to conceal her responsibility, but rather to ensure that investigators would be able to reconstruct the events with sufficient accuracy to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. She had arranged the bodies in dignified positions, closed eyes and folded hands, in gestures that demonstrated more respect for the dead than the victims had ever shown to those they had brutalized during their lifetimes. The first discovery of the mass death came when household slaves arrived for their morning duties and found the dining room filled with corpses. The initial reaction was panic and confusion, as no one could immediately comprehend how 17 healthy adults could have died simultaneously during what was supposed to have been a celebratory dinner. Some suspected epidemic disease, others feared supernatural intervention, and a few immediately suspected poisoning, though none could imagine the scale and complexity of what had actually occurred. Word of the tragedy spread throughout Yazoo County with remarkable speed, carried by riders who galloped between plantations, sharing news that seemed too extraordinary to be credible. By mid-morning, dozens of plantation owners, local officials, and curious citizens had gathered at Willowbrook to witness what was being described as the most mysterious mass death in Mississippi history. The local sheriff, a man named Thomas Bradshaw, who had never investigated anything more complex than occasional thefts of livestock or disputes between neighbors, found himself confronting a case that would have challenged the capabilities of the most experienced criminal investigators. The scene contained no obvious signs of violence, no evidence of forced entry, and no immediately apparent cause of death that could account for the simultaneous demise of so many people. Dr. Marcus Harrison, the physician who had been prevented from attending the anniversary celebration by Celia's deceptive message, arrived at Willowbrook around noon and began the first systematic examination of the bodies. His medical training enabled him to recognize symptoms consistent with poisoning, but the variety and complexity of the toxic effects suggested the involvement of multiple substances administered in ways that required sophisticated knowledge of plant chemistry and human physiology. The investigation was further complicated by the social and political prominence of the victims. Senator Pembroke's death would require notification of state government officials, while Judge Claiborne's demise had implications for pending legal cases throughout the circuit court system. The deaths of multiple wealthy plantation owners would disrupt cotton production and slave trading arrangements that affected the regional economy. The scope of the tragedy extended far beyond the immediate loss of life to encompass political and economic consequences that would reverberate throughout Mississippi society. As the investigation proceeded, attention naturally focused on Celia as the person who had been responsible for preparing and serving the fatal meal. Her calm demeanor and apparent willingness to cooperate with questioning initially suggested innocence, but more detailed examination of the kitchen and surrounding areas revealed evidence of the extensive preparations that had made the mass poisoning possible. Investigators discovered dried plant materials in hidden corners of the root cellar, along with improvised processing equipment that had been used to extract and concentrate toxic compounds. They found detailed notes, written in a careful hand, that demonstrated literacy skills few people had suspected Celia possessed, describing the properties of various poisonous plants and calculating dosages required to achieve lethal effects in human subjects of different weights and physical conditions. Most damning was the discovery of a journal that Celia had maintained throughout the month preceding the anniversary celebration, documenting not only her preparation of the poisons, but also her psychological state and moral reasoning as she planned the systematic murder of 17 people. The entries revealed a level of intellectual sophistication and moral complexity that challenged the racial stereotypes that formed the foundation of antebellum Mississippi society. The journal entries described her observations of the guests' behavior during previous social gatherings, her analysis of their dietary preferences and physical characteristics, and her calculations of the amounts of various poisons required to ensure death, while minimizing the possibility of survival or recovery. But they also contained extended reflections on the moral justification for her actions, demonstrating an ethical framework that was more sophisticated than the crude rationalizations used by her victims to justify slavery. In one particularly revealing entry, dated June 20, 1851, Celia had written, "They believe we are animals incapable of moral reasoning. Yet their own behavior demonstrates a level of cruelty that no animal species would inflict upon its own kind. They claim divine authority for their actions, yet they violate every principle of mercy and compassion that forms the foundation of Christian teaching. If I am damned for what I plan to do, then surely they are damned for what they have already done. The only difference is that my actions will bring an end to suffering, while theirs perpetuate it indefinitely." Another entry, dated July 8, 1851, revealed the depth of her understanding of the broader implications of her plan. "I know that my death will follow quickly upon theirs. But I also know that 17 fewer defenders of slavery will remain to perpetuate this system of brutality. Each of these men and women has influence that extends far beyond their own plantations. Their deaths will create opportunities for people with different moral perspectives to assume positions of authority. I cannot know whether those who replace them will be better, but I know they cannot be worse. The discovery of these writings created profound discomfort among the white residents of Yazoo County, as they demonstrated intellectual and moral capabilities that contradicted fundamental assumptions about racial characteristics that justified the entire system of slavery. The idea that an enslaved woman could conceive and execute a plan of such sophistication while simultaneously engaging in complex moral reasoning about the ethics of her actions challenged beliefs that were essential to maintaining white supremacy. As news of the investigation's findings spread throughout Mississippi and beyond, reactions varied dramatically depending on the political and moral perspectives of those who learned about the case. Slavery advocates denounced Celia as a monster whose actions demonstrated the inherent dangers of allowing enslaved people to develop intellectual capabilities beyond those required for manual labor. They argued that the case proved the necessity of stricter controls on slave education and more severe punishments for any signs of insubordination. Abolitionists, meanwhile, saw the Willowbrook massacre as a tragic but understandable response to the systematic brutalities of slavery. They pointed to the extensive documentation of torture and murder that had characterized life at the plantation as evidence that Celia's actions, while extreme, represented a form of justified resistance to intolerable oppression. Some went so far as to describe her as a hero whose courage and intelligence had struck a significant blow against the institution of slavery. The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented in American jurisprudence, as no court had ever been required to adjudicate a case involving the systematic poisoning of so many prominent citizens by a single enslaved individual. The complexity of the evidence, the political implications of the case, and the intellectual capabilities demonstrated by the defendant created challenges that exposed fundamental contradictions in the legal framework governing slavery. Celia's trial began on August 15, 1851, in the Yazoo County Courthouse, presided over by Judge William Thornbrook, who had been brought in from Jackson due to the deaths of local judicial officials in the poisoning. The proceedings attracted national attention, with newspaper reporters from northern and southern states providing detailed coverage that revealed the deep political divisions created by the case. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Hawkins, faced the unusual challenge of proving that someone legally classified as property could be held criminally responsible for actions that demonstrated sophisticated planning and moral reasoning. The defense strategy, developed by a team of lawyers who had volunteered their services without compensation, centered on arguments that Celia's actions represented justified resistance to systematic torture and murder that had been sanctioned by local authorities for decades. The trial testimony included detailed descriptions of the educational demonstrations that had been conducted at Willowbrook, with witnesses describing scenes of brutality so extreme that several jurors became visibly ill during the proceedings. The defense introduced evidence documenting the deaths of dozens of enslaved people at the plantation, including children who had been killed for minor infractions or as examples to maintain discipline among other workers. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Celia herself testified, speaking with an eloquence and intellectual sophistication that astounded courtroom observers who had never heard an enslaved person engage in complex verbal reasoning. Her testimony included detailed explanations of her planning process, her moral justifications for the murders, and her understanding of the broader implications of her actions for the institution of slavery. "I knew that my actions would result in my own death," she testified, her voice remaining steady despite the certainty of her fate. "But I also knew that the deaths of these 17 people would prevent the torture and murder of hundreds of others who would have suffered under their authority in years to come. They created a system that treated human beings as animals, yet their own behavior was more brutal than that of any animal species. I chose to end that brutality in the most efficient way possible, and I accept the consequences of that choice. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts of murder in the first degree. The speed of their decision reflected not uncertainty about Celia's responsibility for the deaths, which had been clearly established through overwhelming evidence, but rather their discomfort with the implications of her testimony and the moral complexities raised by the case. Judge Thornbrook sentenced Celia to death by hanging, a judgment that was carried out on September 3, 1851, in the public square of Yazoo City. The execution attracted thousands of spectators, including many who had traveled from distant states to witness the conclusion of what newspapers had described as the most extraordinary criminal case in American history. Celia's final statement, delivered from the gallows with the same calm dignity she had maintained throughout the trial, became one of the most widely quoted speeches in the abolitionist movement. I die, knowing that I have struck a blow for justice that will echo through history. The 17 people I killed devoted their lives to the systematic brutalization of human beings who had committed no crime other than being born with dark skin. Their deaths have ended decades of suffering and will prevent decades more. If there is justice in heaven, then God will judge between their actions and mine, and I am content to accept that judgment. The execution of Celia marked the official end of legal proceedings related to the Willowbrook massacre. But the case continued to reverberate through American society in ways that extended far beyond the immediate legal consequences. The sophisticated planning she had demonstrated, the intellectual capabilities revealed through her writings and testimony, and the moral framework she had articulated for her actions challenged fundamental assumptions about race, slavery, and human nature that formed the foundation of antebellum Southern society. In the months following her execution, several developments emerged that added new dimensions to understanding the case and its implications. The first of these was the discovery of additional documentation that had been hidden in various locations around Willowbrook Plantation, including correspondence between Celia and other enslaved people on neighboring plantations that revealed the existence of a communication network far more sophisticated than white authorities had previously suspected. These letters, written in a code that combined elements of African languages with English words, described detailed intelligence-gathering operations that had been ongoing for several years before the anniversary celebration. Enslaved people on multiple plantations had been systematically documenting the brutal practices of their owners, sharing information about punishment techniques, recording the names and ages of people who had been killed or sold, and maintaining genealogical records that tracked the separation of families across the regional slave trade. The correspondence revealed that Celia's plan had been known to and supported by a network of enslaved people who had provided assistance in gathering materials, creating alibis, and ensuring that her preparations could be completed without detection. The level of organization and coordination demonstrated by this network challenged assumptions about the intellectual capabilities and social organization of enslaved communities that had been used to justify their continued bondage. Perhaps most significantly, the letters revealed that the Willowbrook massacre had been planned as part of a broader campaign of resistance that was intended to extend to other plantations throughout Mississippi and neighboring states. Celia's actions were meant to serve as both a demonstration of what was possible and an inspiration for similar acts of resistance by other enslaved people who had the knowledge and opportunity to eliminate brutal masters and overseers. This revelation created panic among plantation owners throughout the South, who suddenly realized that their slaves possessed capabilities for organization, planning, and resistance that went far beyond anything they had previously imagined. The idea that systematic poisoning campaigns might be underway on their own properties led to widespread implementation of security measures that included food tasters, locked storage for kitchen supplies, and increased surveillance of enslaved people who worked in proximity to white families. The paranoia generated by these discoveries had profound effects on the daily operations of Southern plantations. as owners struggled to balance their economic dependence on slave labor with their fears of sophisticated revenge plots. Many plantation owners began to reconsider their punishment practices, not out of moral concerns, but from practical recognition that excessive brutality might provoke organized retaliation that could prove far more costly than the short-term benefits of harsh discipline. The case also had significant political implications that extended into the national debate over slavery that was intensifying during the 1850s. Northern abolitionists seized upon Celia's story as evidence of both the moral bankruptcy of slavery and the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people that contradicted Southern claims about racial inferiority. Her writings and testimony were widely circulated in abolitionist publications, where they were presented as proof that enslaved people possessed the same capacity for moral reasoning and strategic thinking as their white counterparts. Southern politicians and intellectuals responded to these developments by arguing that the Willowbrook Massacre demonstrated the dangers of allowing enslaved people to develop literacy and intellectual capabilities beyond those required for manual labor. They pointed to the sophistication of Celia's planning as evidence that education and intellectual development among enslaved people posed existential threats to white society that could only be prevented through stricter controls and more severe punishments for any signs of independent thinking. The debate generated by the case contributed to the increasing polarization between North and South that would ultimately lead to the Civil War. Northern newspapers published detailed accounts of the systematic brutalities that had been documented at Willowbrook, using these revelations to argue that slavery was incompatible with basic principles of human decency and Christian morality. Southern publications responded by emphasizing the violence of Celia's actions and arguing that her behavior demonstrated the inherent dangers of the abolitionist movement's efforts to encourage resistance among enslaved populations. Federal investigators who examined the case files in the 1860s following the Union occupation of Mississippi discovered additional evidence that had been suppressed or overlooked during the original investigation. This included testimony from enslaved witnesses who had been prevented from speaking during Celia's trial, along with documentation of similar resistance activities on other plantations that suggested the Willowbrook Massacre was part of a much broader pattern of organized opposition to slavery than had been publicly acknowledged. One particularly significant discovery was a detailed map, drawn in Celia's hand, that identified the locations of mass graves where victims of plantation brutality had been buried in unmarked locations throughout Yazoo County. The map included precise directions to dozens of burial sites, along with notes identifying the individuals who had been interred at each location and the circumstances of their deaths. Archaeological investigations conducted during the Reconstruction period confirmed the accuracy of Celia's map, leading to the discovery of remains that provided physical evidence of the systematic violence that had characterized slavery in the region. Forensic examination of the skeletal remains revealed evidence of torture, mutilation, and execution that corroborated the written accounts of brutality that had been documented in Celia's journal and the correspondence found after her death. These discoveries led to posthumous legal proceedings that resulted in the seizure of several plantations whose owners were determined to have engaged in systematic murder of enslaved people. The property was redistributed to freed slaves as part of Reconstruction-era efforts to provide reparations for the victims of slavery, though these programs were largely abandoned following the end of federal occupation in the 1870s. The long-term historical significance of the Willowbrook Massacre extends far beyond its immediate impact on antebellum Mississippi society. Celia's actions demonstrated capabilities for strategic planning, moral reasoning, and organized resistance that challenged fundamental assumptions about race and human nature that had been used to justify slavery. Her writings provided insight into the intellectual and emotional lives of enslaved people that contradicted stereotypes and revealed the depth of suffering caused by systematic brutality. Modern historians who have studied the case recognize it as one of the most sophisticated acts of resistance in American history, comparable in its planning and execution to the most celebrated military campaigns of the Civil War era. The precision with which Celia calculated dosages, timed the administration of multiple poisons, and coordinated the logistical elements of her plan demonstrates intellectual capabilities that would have been impressive in any context, and are particularly remarkable given the educational limitations imposed on enslaved people. The moral framework that Celia articulated for her actions, both in her private writings and in her courtroom testimony, provides valuable insight into the ethical reasoning of people who lived under systematic oppression. Her argument that violence directed against oppressors was morally justified when it served to prevent greater violence against innocent victims reflects sophisticated understanding of moral philosophy that challenges assumptions about the intellectual capabilities of people who had been denied formal education. Perhaps most importantly, the Willowbrook Massacre serves as a reminder that resistance to oppression takes many forms, some of which may not be immediately recognizable as political action. Celia's systematic elimination of 17 prominent defenders of slavery represents one of the most effective acts of resistance in American history, removing from positions of power individuals whose continued influence would have perpetuated systematic brutalization of hundreds or thousands of other human beings. This mystery shows us that even in the darkest periods of American history, individuals found ways to resist oppression and fight for justice, even when such resistance required extraordinary personal sacrifice. Celia's story demonstrates that intellectual capability, moral reasoning, and strategic thinking are human characteristics that cannot be suppressed by legal or social systems that attempt to deny the fundamental humanity of oppressed people. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? The official records were sealed for nearly a century, and some historians argue that additional evidence may still exist in private collections or family archives. Could there have been other participants in the conspiracy who escaped detection? Were there similar resistance networks operating on other plantations throughout the antebellum South that have never been discovered or documented by historians? The questions surrounding Celia's Last Supper continue to fascinate researchers and challenge our understanding of resistance, justice, and the human capacity for both cruelty and courage. Her methodical preparation of that deadly feast represents one of the most sophisticated acts of vengeance in American history, executed by a woman whose very humanity had been legally denied by the society that ultimately executed her for refusing to accept that denial. The 17 deaths at Willowbrook Plantation on that humid July evening in 1851 eliminated some of Mississippi's most influential defenders of slavery during a critical period in American history. Whether viewed as murder or justice, Celia's actions demonstrated that even under the most oppressive systems, individuals retain the capacity for moral agency and the power to shape history through acts of extraordinary courage and determination. The legacy of that Last Supper extends far beyond the immediate deaths it caused, challenging us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, resistance, and the price of freedom that remain relevant more than 170 years after Celia walked to the gallows with dignity intact and purpose fulfilled. Leave your comment below, and let us know what you think about this incredible story from America's darkest period. If you enjoyed this tale of historical mystery, and want more stories like this, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves diving deep into the hidden corners of American history. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another dark chapter that history tried to forget.